What's up, everyone? Welcome back. It's going to be a short and sweet one today. I'm going to go over how to set up camera views based on the last session that I did on storyboarding the initial sequences for the comic book. So I'm going to be setting up some camera positions in Blender, and then I'm going to be able to use some tools such as camera tracking, adding a little bit of motion to the camera, and so on to show you basically where you find these settings to be able to set up some interesting camera motions and or cinematic camera motions in Blender 3D. So we'll get right into it. All right. So first off, we have here our scene in Blender. It's not necessarily the one I'll end up using, but I will set up the camera. I'm going to have to simplify this later on, but I'll set up the camera in this file in order to show you today how to do the camera tracking and the camera position. So I have a few cameras in the scene already, so there might be one that doesn't have a motion just yet. So let's look through here. We've got this one set up. This one does not seem to have any tracking. We'll look at the next one. All right, so it looks like I'm using all my cameras. So I'll go ahead and duplicate this one since this has the closest angle to the one that I want to use. So Shift D, you see the camera moving around there. Escape, have it go to its original position. And then I'll select it here in order to change it. As usual, I will go ahead and split the screen off so I can see what is going on through the camera view. And so I can manipulate the scene in 3D over on this side. So in the image sequences, I'm going to start out way up into the sky, kind of far away. And I want to make sure that I'm first off looking at the right object so that it kind of follows into that object. So what I'll do here for the camera is go over here to Object Constraint Properties, add an object constraint, and right here in tracking, I can select tracked to in order to have it track to a certain object. So I'll zoom in here now and just kind of have it track into, let's say, this logo object that's up here. So select the camera, go back to the object constraint, target. I can hit the eyedropper and select that object right there. So the camera is now tracking to that object. Now, in order to have it track properly, if we see over here how the camera is looking, it is looking straight on to the object, right? So the reason why we can't see anything on the left might be because of the clipping. I might have my camera set up too far away. So right here in the camera properties, I'll put the end here. I'll just raise it up. There we go. We start to see the landscape popping back in, and the clipping plane is moving further and further away so I could see my scene. All right. Now, from what I had storyboarded in the last video, this is not where I'd like to start. I'm gonna first off make sure my timeline is open. So I'm working on the proper timestamp. So in the timeline, make sure I'm at frame 0, and I'm at the very beginning of the sequence. Ooh, somehow I got jumped into frame 221. So the way that this will end up exporting, I'm going to use this camera to go through all the views and stagger out the keyframes and make note of the keyframes so that ultimately the end product is going to be the stills, not necessarily animation, although I do want to be able to export the animation later on if I want to tweak or refine this a little bit better. But for my intents and purposes, I'm setting up a camera animation ultimately to export stills, right? To sort of match my storyboard at the moment. So at frame 0, I have the camera pretty far away, but I don't quite have the angle that I would like. And that's primarily because my focal length is too zoomed in, right? I'm looking for something that's going to make it look more aerial. So I'm also too low compared to the landscape. So I'll go over to a side view and move the camera higher up. There we are. And I'm even too wide now. I'll go ahead and stick to a 24. So I'm properly high enough. I'll move it further away and increase my, I'm just gonna go ahead and make my clipping plane an even number with an extra 0 from where I was at. All right, that's pretty good. So now I'll set up some camera movement. In order to do that, I'm going to go ahead here to go to the object properties where I have my coordinates. And what I'm going to do is start setting up keyframes so that I have this position recorded at this point in time on the timeline. To do that, I'm just going to click and drag down on the location and rotation. Actually, not the rotation, because the rotation is being determined by the tracking in order to look at the proper object. So I'm going to go ahead here and just click and drag down over the keyframes that I want to save, and they turn yellow. That's where our keyframe is located. Next, I'll jump over, say to, and I can slide the keyframes to different positions later on, but for now, I'm going to slide over to 100, kind of space them out evenly. So I know I have to go through maybe within 400 frames, that'll give me 4 different camera positions. So I'll jump over to frame 100 and move my camera. So I'll move the camera a bit more overhead. So we see we have some movement and some rotation. So I've moved closer, but I'll go to the top view and move it over to this side. It's a bit too high up from where I'd like it. So move it down a bit closer. There we are. Okay. From here, I'm going to end up zooming into it, but for now, I'm going to go ahead and, it seems like I jumped over accidentally somehow to frame 185, but that's fine because I'll just click and drag over the location again and then move my keyframe by clicking on it and dragging it over to frame 100 where it should be. Okay. Now, in order to actually see the animation, I'm going to have to take away some elements because I have a lot going on in this scene. So I'll hide things such as not the main shape, but I'll hide the clouds in the background. I'll hide some other features here, furniture, all the plants, more furniture, more plants. Gonna keep the water. I'm gonna hide the island because it has some vegetation on it. So that should allow me to be able to animate through the frames a bit more smoothly so I can preview what this motion would look like. All right. Hit play. Might be because I'm in battery saver mode. This is moving very, very slow for me. I'm suspecting it's because I don't have my laptop plugged in. Would probably put it on a better performance setting, or possibly just because my file is quite heavy and I have some other cameras that are animated in this file as well, so I have multiple cameras moving through the scene at once. So I'll go ahead and pause that, select my camera so I can set up my next scene, go to frame 200, select the camera. Now what I want to do is keep this camera position, but I want to actually sort of punch zoom into the scene or the object that I'm tracking to. So the object that I was tracking to was this logo that's above. What I actually want to start tracking towards is this bottom entry scene right here so I can later rotate into it. So I have to change what I'm tracking the camera to as I'm zooming in a little bit. And I can then tweak those two things that are going on at the same time. I'll go over here to my object constraint properties. So I have here the object that I'm tracking to, which is currently this object up here, the TVM. So if I want to track over to an object that's out here, I'll zoom in on the 3D side so we can pick something to track to differently. So say I want to track to this base object here. My zoom is kind of messed up. Let's see if maybe going into a camera view can help me with this. I've looked up a lot of solutions to fix the zoom aspect because it can get messed up when you're moving around a lot in a scene. But I haven't quite found any other solution besides getting into a different camera and then start orbiting outside of that one. So it's like if you have different cameras set up in your scene, you select one that's closer to where you're trying to operate, and then you start rotating out of that camera view. And that seems to, for the most part, fix those zoom issues. So these steps are actually a bit better for me to zoom into than this base because I don't want to center into that base. I'd rather center into the staircase. So that's the object that I'm going to choose to switch my tracking to. So I'll select the camera. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just duplicate this tracking option here so that I have another track. And I'm going to select that object of the staircase. So what I'm going to do in order to switch my tracking from one object to another is keyframe the tracking influence. So if I go over to frame 100, where I finish my camera movement into this position, I will keyframe here the influence factor on the tracking, jump back to frame 200, set up a keyframe, well, actually should go back to 100, set up a keyframe for the other tracking influence as well. But rather than have it, so right now influence is set to 1 and 1 for both objects, I gotta set one of them to 0. So if I set the influence for the second object to 0, now I'm just tracking to the original object, right? When the keyframe turns orange, that means I've made a change that isn't saved to the keyframe. So I just gotta double click on that keyframe there, turn it yellow, that means it's set. Now I jump over to keyframe 200 and I just flip them around. So I set this one to 0 and I set this one to 1. And I set a keyframe here and here. Okay. Now, from frame 100 to frame 200, that'll shift the tracking from the original object to the other object. Now, in order to also punch zoom in while this change in tracking is happening, I'm going to keyframe another element here. So essentially, we've gone over keyframing a camera position, keyframing tracking elements. Any element here or any property in Blender by the camera that has one of these dots on the side, you can add a keyframe for. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keyframe on the focal length. So the focal length up until this point has been set to 24 millimeters. I'll go ahead and animate that property by setting a keyframe here, jump back to 200, and change that to whatever I'd like to zoom into. So let's try 120 millimeter. That's pretty good. Maybe 140, 180. Maybe what I want to do is keep it at a 140 and then actually move the camera a bit closer at the same time. So I'll keyframe that there for frame 200. Have my camera selected. So I will also move it just a tiny bit closer. And there we go, with some nice rotation so we can reveal the staircase. All right, I'm good with that. And then we'll set this here to new camera position. So as you saw, it was orange, and by clicking there, I've now set a new position for those. I didn't change the Z value, which is why it's still green. It didn't turn orange for me to create a keyframe, but I could click here to set that as a constant so that it doesn't change the Z value from one to the other, but I'll leave that blank for now. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and save my file, and I can preview what this animation is gonna look like like actually export it by hitting View and Viewport Render Animation. So that's going to essentially render out this animation in the style that I have it for the file at the moment, and it's actually going to export those images. I could preview it in the file, but it would take quite a bit right now because this file that I'm working with is a bit dense. I have to eventually rebuild this file. So what I'll do is I'll move these frames over. Actually, I'll keep it where it is because it'll work pretty fast. I'm gonna export right now 200 frames. And in order to set that, right now I have up to 400 frames. So I'll start at 0 right here on the right, and I'll set it to 200 instead. So I just stick to the camera motion that I just created. Over on the right hand side, if I go to Output Properties, and I set to a different folder here under the output settings so that I can preview what this animation is going to look like. I'll go over into my project folder, and I'll create a new folder in here. For the first sequence. All right. Accept to save there. Go ahead and go to View, Viewport Render Animation. And that's quickly going to slide through all those images in solid view. So you can see there the counter number over my mouse cursor. I'm going to take this chance while it's exporting all these different frames to quickly grab my charger. Hopefully that will expedite my computer, or make my computer faster and expedite this process. It's a damn thing, the whole laptop power thing. If you're working off of desktop, I mean, it's constant, but you're not portable. And the way I've set up my laptop is so that I'm able to make the most out of the battery when I'm disconnected out of the charger. So that sacrifices on performance a lot. However, it doesn't really seem to make the battery last that long. Like I could really only get in maybe like 40 minutes of proper 3D work or an hour of proper 3D work on the battery. Maximum maybe like 2 hours, 2.5 hours if I'm not making it too heavy. All right, that seems to be working a bit faster, not as fast as I had hoped for 200 frames. In the meantime, I can tell you a little bit about what's coming up for this project. I can actually also show the original in case you didn't catch the video. I'll AirPlay here from my iPad, so you can see what I'm basing these camera movements on. Right, so I'm working actually through the 3 elements here in the bottom. So kind of looking at that shape from the sky, then punching into the side, or zooming down into the side, and then punching into that entryway. The top sequence is actually going to have to be a different file, which will be a different live stream session, a different video, where I set up this file from scratch, and it'll have to include the same camera. So I'll use the same camera with the same movements, but in 2 separate files. That way in post, I can actually stitch the 2 sequences together. And I'll show how I would do that from exporting these frames out of Blender now when these frames are done exporting. It's a bit strange, or not strange. I haven't quite decided what is best when exporting frames, because Blender can export MP4. You can export video. However, if you export video, you don't have the individual frames, and sometimes that's nice, although you can sort of work it out where if you have a video, you can export all the frames individually, or if you have all the frames, you can then make a video of it. The cool thing about exporting frames I mean, it takes the same amount of time really to do either. But the cool thing about exporting frames is that you have the stills as content, right? So it's like one step less of exporting those frames from the video itself. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely a use case for either. Let's see what frame we're on. We're on frame 150, so we're almost there. I guess I could, in the meantime, open up Photoshop. That's typically where I put together my frames to then export a video, since I use After Effects and Premiere to put clips together. Definitely a lot more of the work is just getting done in Blender, especially some of the Photoshop work, like stylizing frames or stylizing renders through the compositor workspace. You can do a lot of different effects like bloom or lighting effects, saturation, color correction. It's a lot of things that you can end up doing within Blender that just automatically get applied to every frame, which is really fantastic. It just takes an extra step out of the process. All right, frame 182, 183, we're almost there. For those of you watching, if you didn't catch the last video, the recording is still, all the live streams are getting saved to YouTube. I am in the process of editing the lives from this week. It seems like the way it's going to best work for me is to just live stream throughout the week and then do the clip editing on the weekend. So all the clips will make it to the different social media channels and other channels the following week after the lives happen. So, all right, we got all our frames out. I'll go into Photoshop, do File, import video. Well, no, not import, sorry. File, scripts, load files into stack, browse, and I'm gonna find that folder where I saved all these frames into. Can go into here, copy that directory, paste it into here. Can be found, maybe because of the, that's weird. Just have to manually find my folder. There it is, first sequence. Oh, interesting. So it exported as a video because I had that, I had it set to video. I didn't have it set to JPEG or anything. So it's already in a video format. I assumed when I rendered from the viewport without actually rendering that it would do JPEG, but I guess it just follows whatever settings I have set on the right. So as you can see here on Blender, I had it set to an MPEG video, RGB MPEG4, MPEG-4. And you want to make sure you're using H.264. And I mean, medium quality encoding speed, like all that stuff for this case, because I'm just previewing, doesn't quite matter. But we can take a look at the end result. So we see there how that's working out. All right. And definitely there's a step here where the tracking isn't quite working out, or the camera rotation isn't working out, and everything kind of moved out of frame, which is a little odd. It must be from the transition for the tracking. So between frame 100 and frame 200, there's a split influence in the tracking for the camera between the visual mode object, or the TVM logo at the top, and the staircase. So what I got to do is just speed up that transition much quicker, or change the location of those keyframes a lot quicker as to when the tracking changes. I'm not sure if now that I'm plugged in with the charger, if I can actually preview the animation. It doesn't seem like it. My file might just be that heavy that I can't preview the animation within this space, which is a shame. But I got to show you how to export the viewport solid, or the viewport view, which isn't so bad, or is an added bonus to you. Okay, so between frame 100 and frame 200, I'm just gonna edit that tracking. And there's gotta be a way to optimize this. Maybe if I just hide all this extra stuff and all my other cameras. Some of these other cameras have animations in them as well. Maybe if I just hide them out. Can I play through the animation now? Nope, I can't scrub through. It's a real bummer. All right, so frame 100, go to the camera view, or select the camera, and we're gonna tweak on that tracking option. So I'll go to tracking, switch it over to, or I'll clear the keyframes that are currently set just to kind of reset and make it easier on myself just to redo this. So clear keyframes, go to frame 100 where I had set the tracking to change from one to the other. Set a new keyframe. So the camera motion goes from 100 to 200, but I'm actually gonna maybe use the first 10 frames to do that transition and tracking. So I'll go to 110, and I don't want it to be just right into the next frame. And the reason for that is because you'll just see the camera snap, right? It'll just kind of go from one and then right into the other. But I can use the momentum of that initial punch zoom movement to kind of hide in the fact that we're shifting our focus. So I'll now type 0 here and 1 here. Keyframe those. All right. So this is another thing, right? Why I should probably be doing not the video in this scenario. I want to be exporting frames rather than the entire video out of Blender, because frames 0 to 100 haven't changed. So rather than re-exporting frames 0 to 100, I would only be re-exporting zeros 100 to 200, right? So I'd be waiting half the amount of time to export those frames in order to correct my animation. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. If I go over here to the render properties, or sorry, output properties, where I had set my folder, I'm going to now switch from FFmpeg video over to a JPEG. And quality cannot be that great because, again, I'm just previewing everything. You can set a color management here, but not relevant at this point in time. And also the resolution, I don't need full resolution. I can get away with 30%. I didn't think that all these settings for render settings might affect the viewport render output when I go here to viewport render animation, but it seems like it followed those settings. So maybe if I decrease the quality, we'll see it also change down to 30%, which should increase our speed right now because we're just previewing things, right? And it's taking a little bit for 200 frames, but not bad. Cool. While that's going on, I'm going to open up a new Blender file. Now that I've shown you that I have another sequence that comes just before this one actually that utilizes the same camera, I'm going to bring that camera over into the new file, or into the separate file that's going to mirror this transition, so that I can now work out of that one, and that'll be a bit more efficient. So if I go over to the Blender file that's exporting right now, select this camera, and you've seen me link things from one file to another using append, but in this scenario I'm just going to copy this camera and it should paste right into here. I delete everything in this file, paste objects. Nope. Copy. Might have to wait for the animation to finish. Copied. Paste. There we go. Looks like I selected a few things to paste into here. So, oh, it brought in the objects that it was tracking to. So I guess because the camera was related to those two objects for tracking, it actually brought in those two as well. So let's see how this file does, since it only has the 3 objects, if I can actually go through. Yeah, so we can actually preview the camera motions here. My other file was much too heavy. And I can already see we're going to have this weird thing happening here, where the camera seems to be like snapping off into the side and then going over to the other object. So there's some weird glitch happening here with the tracking settings. So I could actually just stop what's going on with the other file. All right, so while that stops, and actually tweak the camera in this file on its own, which will be faster, and then bring it back into that original file. Okay, so we'll go over to our object constraint properties, select the camera. Let's see what's happening here. So between 0 or between 101, move it over to frame 100. So in the tracking switch, it's sort of veering off to the left. So I can fix this by actually speeding up the influence of the second object. So it will lose the influence of the first object sooner, and slower, it'll introduce the tracking to the new object a bit quicker. So I'll delete the keyframes for the clear keyframes for the second tracking. And we'll introduce that tracking a bit sooner. So maybe frame 90 rather than frame 100. So keyframe that there. And then once we get to 105, this is where we see the camera going off to the side when it's losing the tracking on the other object. So if I bring the influence back onto the staircase all the way back to 1 and set that there, if I scroll back, there's still a bit of weirdness happening, although it's minimized now. So we see it's happening right around frame 100. It's like starts to arch around. I'll zoom in so you can see what I mean. Rather than just coming down from V right onto the staircase, it does this weird curve before it gets to the staircase. I'll see if I can tweak that by just moving the keyframe over to the left a little bit more. There we go. So that's a much smoother movement right there for the camera. All right. That solved a lot, bringing it over to an empty file for me to just tweak the camera motion. And I can actually continue to use this file now to build out my second sequence. So I'm going to save this in order to come back to this on the next live stream. Cool. And I'll copy the camera and paste it back into my original file. I can actually delete the camera that was here now, paste it in. Let's look through that new, did it paste in? It pasted in the other objects. I don't think it did. Copy and go back, paste. 3 objects pasted, but I don't see my new camera. Oh, it's being pasted down here. All right, so got a bit of a duplicates going on right now. I'll reorganize these into their proper location. But if we look through the camera now, I'm just gonna snap through the different scenes. So I know that the problematic frames were frame 100 to 105, just about. So I'll go to those frames. I see there that I'm just above my steps. And if I'm hitting plus, by the way, plus and minus over the timeline to zoom into the timeline and zoom out. Pretty sure Premiere and After Effects work the same way. And yeah, it doesn't look like there's an arch there through the frames. So it just goes straight down from one object to the other. Cool. I'll go ahead and zoom out. Oops, not zoom out of there. I'll zoom out of my frames. Save the file. And I will re-export the animation and have that animation rendered out probably overnight to actually have it like look decent and not just look like everything's a gray mess. So now that I have that camera motion, I have my second sequence for the opening of the comic book. I'm going to use the animation as a sort of proof of concept for the camera motion and to introduce the clipped version of this session. But really what I'm looking for is like those 3 frames for the ultimate project, right? But I figured if I have to set up the cameras and I want to track to an object, I'd show you how to get those camera settings done as I'm doing that in the process. So next time we'll take a look at that first sequence, which will mirror this file so I can stitch in the 2 animations together, how we open up to this empty world with many, many different digital worlds, and then we zoom into this one world where our story starts to take place. So thanks for joining in. I hope this helped with understanding a bit more of camera motion and camera tracking in Blender. And if you would like to see anything else from me on the subject or out of Blender as I'm working on this project, you can go ahead and leave a comment on what that is. And if I know it, I'll explain it. And if I don't, I'll figure it out first and then I'll explain it. Have a great Saturday, everyone. Great weekend. And stay tuned for all the little highlights coming out. Bye.